Just a word about how we got where we are. So what you see here over the course of evolution is, look what's happening in the forehead. This is the prefrontal cortex, and this area here is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Huge, huge growth there. In some ways, that's the story of human evolution, that and bipedal posture. 20% of the human brain is composed of the frontal lobes. In cats, it's about 3%. What's in there? The executive brain, executive control center. This is the part of the brain that develops last, in the sense of myelination, which is the fatty insulation that covers neurons and neural networks. It makes transmission much, much more efficient. And you also see you see some major developmental effects at various ages in this lack of myelination. In terms of functions, identity and insight, sense of self, the database for these are, again, getting shot in the head in Iraq, and also increasingly imaging studies, which allow us to look at what's happening without the presence of a trauma. We're also moving more and more away from the idea of which has been very, very influential in neuroscience, the triune brain. You've got a reptilian part, the brainstem. You've got a mammalian part, the limbic system, and you've got the most highly evolved part, the frontal lobes and the cortex. Actually, the limbic system is functionally, these are just really kind of reifications. This is all to say that emotion and cognition are very, very closely related in the brain, and in many cases inseparable. Some would say only another brain could love something that looks like this. Can't do without it. It's the PFC up here, and the OFC, part of the frontal lobe that's right behind your eyes, the orbits. Dorsolateral, like the dorsal fin, kind of more on top of your head, is working memory, how you remember phone numbers. Very transient information, usually about 20 seconds. Some people, neuroscientists, have defined that as the contents of consciousness. Any 20-second interval, that's in the prefrontal, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And these are some aspects of the PFC. See major changes in people's ability to get along socially when this is damaged. See much more labile affects, rage states, and impulsive sexuality. The capacity for empathy the OFC is very important for that. In imaging studies, when moms and babies are together, for instance, you see just huge amounts of activation. So we think it has a lot to do with attachment, warmth, and love, and connections with the limbic system around managing anxiety. This is poor Phineas Gage, who I talked about earlier, with the spike going on. Very briefly, what happens, the primary mode of transmission within a neuron is essentially electrical, based on some chemical changes and polarities. The primary mode of communication between neurons is neurochemical. It occurs in this little tiny gap between an axon and a dendrite, and the transmitter and the receiver. Although you don't hear much about these neurotransmitters. You're always hearing about serotonin. The two of the most common ones in the brain, the big ones, are glutamate, which excites, really exciting for another neuron, and GABA, the inhibitory transmitter. We also think more in terms of excitement than we do in terms of inhibition. If you think about psychoanalysis, though, this is kind of interesting, like kind of a little bit of a libidinal feel about this, and a little bit of Freud's thing about excitement and inhibition. Freud was one of the most promising neuroscientists of his time before psychoanalysis. Before 1900, he had published 100 neuroscience studies, and then he just walked away from it. William James, arguably the other greatest, most influential psychologist of the early 20th century, same thing. Fantastic education, European education in neurophysiology. Came back, walked away from it, got interested in philosophy. After that point, the brain went out of psychology. Even behaviorism. Behaviorism says, don't go in there. It's a black box. Psychoanalysis, it's all this reification. What is libido? Is it glutamate? Is it GABA? We're now in a position much more where these things are becoming tangible in a way that we can test hypotheses. The importance of inhibition is that the brain is in this resting state of massive, very close to chaos. You listen to it, and it's a roar. It's like the ocean in a storm or 100-mile-an-hour wind. Huge amount of random noise. And when people start to attend to something, it quiets down. So the activity of the brain actually, as it gets organized around something like an intentional act, subsides. And these are some, commonly known and extremely important neurochemicals. Dopamine. Worth noting that dopamine, in many cases in the brain, activates and rewards. It's the gumball that you get when you are pleased with yourself. Also connected with pleasure. It's also connected with it does many very different things at different sites in the brain. That's complexity. The way the system defines even the function of things, of the elements in the system. Norepinephrine, adrenaline, serotonin, acetylcholine, the neuropeptides involved in pain relief, and oxytocin, very important in bonding and attachment. And these are some of the sites in the brain. They're points at which these neurotransmitters and neuromodulators are manufactured. We're not even going to get into hormones, which are not manufactured. Where hormones are like much more of a whole body kind of thing that influence the brain. But those are some of the sites.